Hello everyone, welcome to From the Star Wars Library, where Star Wars is in print, the Force is with the readers, and Star Wars comics return after a brief hiatus starting in 1988 with Dark Empire #1 in this episode. I'm your host Nathan P. Butler, and as I said, it's a big deal in Star Wars publishing here. Last episode we took a look at the launch of the official continuity in mid-1991 with Heir to the Empire from Bantam Spectra. It's Timothy Zahn's first Star Wars novel, first novel of the Star Wars Thrawn trilogy, and the first Star Wars novel since 1983. First one to be produced under the auspices of this new official continuity, a part of the expanded universe of licensed products meant to all fit together. C-canon, we might say, but it's a little more to it, a little more nuanced than just that. Now we look at where Star Wars comics came back. And that was with the Dark Empire 6-issue miniseries beginning in December of 1991 and running through late 1992. Now, again, at this point, Star Wars fans can watch the Star Wars trilogy as a boxed set on VHS in full screen. There is no widescreen set yet. That doesn't come until 1992. So we're in an odd place in Star Wars fandom. You can check out more information on that in the beginning of our previous episode about Heir to the Empire. In this case, what we get is a 6-issue series from Dark Horse Comics written by Tom Veitch with art by Cam Kennedy and covers by Dave Dorman. The first issue we have is this one here, entitled Destiny of a Jedi. Then we have issue number 2, Devastator of Worlds. And don't you love that early on, a lot of times we got individual issue titles instead of just storyline titles? I think that was kind of cool back in the day. We have The Battle for Calamari, Dark Empire issue number 3. We have issue number 4, Confrontation on the Smugglers' Moon. Issue 5, Emperor Reborn. Extremely controversial, the idea of the Emperor being brought back. We'll talk about that more here coming up. And a very triumphant looking cover, The Fate of a Galaxy, Dark Empire number 6. With Leia there holding the lightsaber. Really an iconic image from the covers of this series. Now, some of you completists out there might be saying, wait a second. That's not where it actually started. There was a preview issue, wasn't there? Well, yes, there is a preview issue, but notice the preview issue has the cover of the first edition trade paperback. That should give you a clue of what you're seeing. This is a preview of issue number 1 that sold for 99 cents through Dark Horse. This was released in 1996, a few years later. So the preview is actually not a preview of the miniseries. The preview is a preview of the trade paperback in that sense. So yes, there is a preview issue, but it came out later. Speaking of coming out later, in 1994, there was an audio drama adaptation of this story, which was really quite good. Has some of my favorite moments in it, like Luke tossing down his lightsaber and saying to the Emperor as he kneels, "Yes, my father's destiny is my own." One of the things that really sticks in my mind from that audio drama. And eventually, there would be sequels to this. Dark Empire 2, another 6-issue series, and Empire's End, a 2-issue series, all of which would also get their own audio dramatizations. Dark Empire 1 was available originally on audio cassette, Dark Empire 2 as audio cassette. Eventually, they did a boxed set, which is this, Dark Empire, the Collector's Edition, which included the audio dramatization of, you can see the sort of the disc art there, an audio dramatizations of Dark Empire 1 and 2 on CD, and exclusively at the time, the audio dramatization of Empire's End. So it's the entire Dark Empire cycle or Dark Empire trilogy, if you want to call it that, there in audio drama format. So either way, there's a couple of different ways you could go about checking out this story if you're not someone who's really big into comics. Just check out the audio dramas instead. Another thing to note here quickly, this went through a lot of different printings. I actually picked these up once the first few issues were already on their second or third printing, and I only got the last couple as first printings until years later I bought a set of the first printings as I went through. But you can tell a big difference between the first printing and subsequent printings of issue number 1. In each issue, you got the cool Dave Dorman cover, right? You got A Long Time Ago in a Galaxy Far, Far Away on the back, which I thought was kind of neat at the time, different colors each time. Interior art is by Cam Kennedy, one of those kind of love it or hate it art styles. I'll take a look at that in a later issue here. But in the very back, you get these segments that are sort of miniature essays about certain elements of Star Wars. The background of which is going to give information on people like Ulic Qel-Droma, Exar Kun, setting up the concept for what eventually becomes the Tales of the Jedi comic series. But if you look in the first printing, it says, the question was no sooner asked than it was answered. With violence, powerful admirals and fleet commanders took up arms against each other and against the Empire's ruling circle in ferocious contention for control of the Empire. And yet, Luke's teachers nearly despaired over his willingness to... Wait, what? How do we jump to Luke? They put the pages in the wrong order. Yet the A Time of Darkness page, it's supposed to then go to one, the Alliance seizes the day, then... the one that starts with that paragraph with no title because it's continuing from the previous page, then Powers of a Jedi, which then wraps it all up. But they put them in the wrong order in the first printing. If you have a second printing or later, then yeah, they put them there in the correct order that time. That's a very easy way if you can't tell just by looking on the inside where it says, Star Wars Dark Empire 1 of 6, second printing. If you don't want to look there, check out the back. This is one of those few times where a first and second printing of a Star Wars comic actually has a content difference, albeit just a mistake being fixed. Again, taking a look at the artwork real quick, Cam Kennedy's art style, it's something that's really sort of a love it or hate it sort of thing. Lots of purples, lots of blues, lots of greens, lots of reds, not a lot of detail, an unusual art choice. But it was actually similar art and a similar collaboration between Tom Veitch and Cam Kennedy on a series called The Light and Darkness War that actually got this series a chance to go ahead in the first place. So you could say Cam Kennedy's art was part of the impetus of allowing Star Wars comics to continue, so we can't exactly gripe too much about it. Personally, I like it in Dark Empire 1. I don't think it works as well in Dark Empire 2, and then Dark Empire 3 goes to an art style that's even crappier overall. It's just really not a good art style for Empire's End. The series also, again, introduces new concepts into the Star Wars saga. We find that after the events of the Thrawn trilogy, the Empire takes back Coruscant briefly. We find out that the Empire is still in existence, the remnant is still out there, and that a part of it is now under the command of Palpatine, who managed to escape his death on the Death Star by going into a clone body, which he also does later here as he gets into another clone body that's much younger. The thought process here was that at the time, that the dark side causes Palpatine's body to degenerate, so he was using clones several times before he actually died in Return of the Jedi, and then it would be later on, this is another clone body that's dying, and he switches to another young clone body, and then he's just sort of burning through them. That was then tweaked, and Lucas said, no, the body that we see Palpatine dying in Return of the Jedi is the same body he's in all throughout the prequel trilogy and such, his original body, and the reason why he's deteriorated is not because of age of the dark side per se, but because of what happens to him in Revenge of the Sith, with sort of the lightning coming back at him and all that kind of stuff. So we have a different origin for that. They've had to tweak that since then. This story features Luke doing sort of a Ulic Qel-Droma type thing, which we'll see later, going into the dark side as a way to try to defeat the Emperor, learn its secrets from within. We see the advent of the World Devastators trying to destroy Mon Calamari. We see some new technology like the E-Wings and such. We are going to find that Leia is pregnant with Anakin Solo here. Their third child eventually gives birth to Anakin in the later stories of this cycle, the Dark Empire cycle here. And get a chance to find out that Boba Fett is in fact alive, which we find at the end of issue number 3, as I've shown you guys previously on a previous episode with the whole, "Hey, Mr. Fett, to see you, sir. Hey, Mr. Fett, to see you, sir." And sure enough, first story page of 4, there's Boba Fett. Now, Boba had, of course, escaped back in Jawas of Doom in the Marvel series, got knocked back into the Sarlacc pit. The story of how he got out this time around will come in later tales, with the help of Dengar and such. One of the few times that Lucas looked at something and said, okay, here's what my film says, this is my canon, what we now call G-canon, but then said, you want to use the character? Use him. Just say he got out. For years, Lucas would continue to say, in my saga, Boba Fett is dead, but that was not something allowed to override anything that Lucas Books or Lucasfilm wanted to do with their spin-offs like this. So Boba Fett is officially back as of Dark Empire issue number 4. And we just see Leia take on sort of more of the Jedi tradition. We get introduced to holocrons. Lots of cool stuff in this series. The Eclipse-class Star Destroyer, Force Storms. Very cool new additions to the Star Wars saga. Set a year after the events of the Thrawn trilogy, but not originally meant to be so. Thanks in part to Timothy Zahn basically being an ass about it. From what I understand, from what I'm seeing on interviews and stuff given around the time. Alright, so here's sort of the backstory of how this series got started. There came a point when Cam Kennedy and Tom Veitch, the artist and writer for this series, had finished up the whole Light and Darkness war for Epic. Okay, Epic Comics was another of those imprints through Marvel, kind of like Star Comics was. And when they finished up, they've been working for Archie Goodwin, who of course was a huge part of Star Wars with the newspaper strips and whatnot. Archie was at Marvel Comics at the time, and they sent George Lucas signed copies of their work for the Light and Darkness War, and basically asking, hey, any chance you'd let us possibly do Star Wars at this point? Because Marvel had just finished up their series a few years ago. They dropped the license, basically. They were done with their main series, done with Ewoks and droids, so the license was kind of up for grabs, and the thought was, well, why not bring it back to Marvel? They'll do Dark Empire, and Dark Empire can be a continuation from what they had done with the Marvel series, in a sense. And it looked like things were totally set. Lucy Wilson wound up contacting, I believe it was Tom Veitch at the time, and said, yeah, let's do it, you know? And there was some question of, well, can we really bring it back to Marvel? Because Marvel had dropped the license. Would they go for it again? There was some resistance to it at first, apparently, but Archie Goodwin, he was sort of Mr. Star Wars, in Tom Veitch's words, because of his whole newspaper strip run, was able to make it happen, to bring Dark Empire to Marvel. Problem was that very soon, Goodwin left Marvel and went to DC. That was not the best of circumstances, and it wound up having blowback, and Dark Empire got knocked down to basically on hold at that point. At which point, kind of frustrated by this, Veitch and Kennedy went to Lucy Wilson at Lucasfilm and said, hey, how's about you guys check out Dark Horse? Maybe they're the ones to do this because they've been publishing these movie tie-ins. They got Aliens and Predator. I mean, that's kind of what Dark Horse is known for, Star Wars being probably the most profitable movie tie-in out there. And they were like, yes, let's do this, and jumped in with Dark Horse to make Dark Empire the launching point of the Dark Horse Star Wars license, and thereby the modern Expanded Universe's official continuity in comic form, to be released the same year as Heir to the Empire would launch it through Bantam Spectra for the novel form of things. The license got basically pulled from Marvel and tossed over to Dark Horse because they just wouldn't do anything with Dark Empire when they had originally planned to. But it was originally in the plans to be a Marvel series set right after their story. Now, the story itself did go through some tweaks. At one point, they had actually planned on this basically being the Empire using Vader's image. Not Vader himself, but someone else in Darth Vader-style armor to carry on the legacy of Darth Vader as if he was still around. Kind of like what happened, ironically, with Timothy Zahn having someone try to, Flim, I think was his name, the actor, trying to carry on the legacy of Thrawn in the Spectre of the Past, Vision of the Future, Hand of Thrawn duology and such. Lucas apparently nixed that. They got the idea, or Lucas came up with the idea, it's hard to say. Veitch has kind of gone back and forth on whose idea it was. Somebody came up with the idea of it being the Emperor reborn as a clone, and that's what stuck for Dark Empire. But this was all fairly early on. In fact, in 1990, in an issue of a Marvel Age preview, we got solicitation for Dark Empire as a 3-issue miniseries from Marvel. It listed the writer as Tom Veitch, which came to pass, the artist as Cam Kennedy, the editor as Margaret Clark. That would not wind up being the case in the series when it finally did see print through Dark Horse. In that case, the editor was Barbara Kessel, hence the Kessel Run. No connection, just kind of amusing. It was meant to be essentially a larger comic. It's meant to be 64 pages at that point per issue, hence being able to be 3 instead of 6. Cover price of each issue, each of these 64-page issues was supposed to be $4.95, originally meant to go on sale in fall of 1990, and the solicitation text read, "This is the sequel fans have been waiting for, as a creative team from the Light and Darkness War reveals what happened in the years following the destruction of the second Death Star. The Rebel Alliance has regrouped and made a successful push toward the center of the galaxy. Princess Leia and Han Solo have discovered the ideal way to curb their feud, by getting married. Luke Skywalker is a full-fledged Jedi Knight. He fights alongside the rebels and trains new Jedi. But the forces of the Emperor and the powers of darkness still live and thrive in the galaxy." So you've got a story already being pitched not only to Marvel to be made, but pitched to fans in Marvel Age as something to be coming out actually a year before it actually did through Dark Horse. When things jumped from Marvel to Dark Horse, of course, plans changed, and it did come out as a 6-issue series of regular-sized issues through Dark Horse Comics. And so a legend was born, Star Wars as a license for Dark Horse, one of their most profitable licenses, certainly a very visible license for them. But I mentioned the whole irony thing of Timothy Zahn using the idea of someone impersonating Thrawn in Hand of Thrawn, whereas there was that whole idea of someone impersonating Vader being a core premise of this until it was nixed. Timothy Zahn may say in his comments in the 20th anniversary edition of Heir to the Empire about how great it is to have background material to jump off of in writing Star Wars, and he does talk in some of the new insiders about how great it was to have the RPG materials present when he was writing to use references of ships and things like that, although he does admit to having been at least somewhat resistant to that at first. The biggest controversy, and I would say this is something not known about until later, but certainly something that just that epitomizes arrogance to me, and hopefully that's not what this was meant to be, but it epitomizes arrogance to me, and I have a bad taste in my mouth from basically anything that Zahn did post Vision of the Future up until Scoundrels, because I think a lot of times he was basically just being asked to come back and write based on his name, certainly not by story quality up to that point. Most of what he did through Del Rey was turning his characters into superheroes and other people into idiots, inept idiots, especially in Choices of One, and basically not giving us the quality we'd come to expect from the Thrawn trilogy or Hand of Thrawn. So understand, I say this with a little bit of a grr towards certain aspects of Zahn's Star Wars writing, though I do think the Thrawn trilogy and the Hand of Thrawn duology were absolutely awesome. Great stuff early on, not so much lately, though Scoundrels was quite good as well. But what gets me about it is he talks about, it's great to have these references. Star Wars is great to have these characters that can all work together and everyone gets a chance to shine. Unless they're film characters and not my characters in the latest stuff. The original plan was that Dark Empire would be set shortly after the Marvel series, bringing the Marvel series presumably in with the continuity. And even when it jumped to Dark Horse, this plan still was, we're going to make this something taking place shortly after Return of the Jedi. In other words, before the Thrawn trilogy. Not 6 years after the end of Return of the Jedi and a year after the Thrawn trilogy, but before the Thrawn trilogy. The Thrawn trilogy would be the furthest back of the two. And when asked, hey, you need to make sure that you bring in some elements of Dark Empire and let that be part of the basis of what you're doing with the Thrawn trilogy, Zahn refused. He said no. Think of the arrogance it has to take to say no when you've just been handed one of the biggest licenses on the planet to play around in, and instead of doing what you're asked, you say, no, I'm not going to do it, screw that. The fact that they wanted a big-name sci-fi guy to launch this out must have saved his butt at that moment. Because somehow, Zahn doesn't get booted off the novels. He's told, oh, okay then. Lucasfilm backed down. And basically went and told Veitch, hey, sorry, you guys in Dark Horse, you're going to have to make Dark Empire take place after the events of The Last Command, after the Thrawn trilogy. So what do? They boot it back, they punt it until afterwards, they change some bits of the art, a little bit of dialogue, and change the opening crawl added to the first issue of Dark Empire and some of the comments made into it in order to make it make sense to be after the Thrawn trilogy. But it was not the original intention. Imagine how continuity would be different now if the Emperor had managed to return shortly after Return of the Jedi until many years later. If Dark Empire had taken place before the events of the Thrawn trilogy. It's a very different post-Return of the Jedi EU, at least for the first decade or so, decade or two, after the events of Return of the Jedi. But no. Zahn said, no, screw that, and got his way. Now we take it for granted that this is the way things were meant to play out because the saga builds from this point. But it all comes down to one man saying no when I would imagine anybody in a modern situation like that would have gotten slapped down really, really badly. They would have been slapped down as if they were starting to try to say that Jar Jar was going to be the next emperor or something. Cannot imagine a modern author being able to say something like that and have Lucasfilm say, okay, we'll rearrange our entire plan because you don't want to do it. Anyway, so cool series, very dark. I like the idea of Luke going to the dark side as a way of trying to get and see it from the inside and bring it down from the inside, destroy the Emperor with his own power. I think Ulick Qel-Droma does it better in Tales of the Jedi, but it works fairly well here. Heck, Quinlan Voss does it a little bit better in the Republic comics as well. But very cool thing. Cool to see Leia start to step up, and just a great launching off point. Dark Empire 2 and Empire's End are not going to be all that great. Dark Empire still stands as one of my favorite Star Wars comics out there, even though I'm sure that's a very divisive opinion to have even these days. So, the question we always ask, is this, Dark Empire, the original 6-issue miniseries, an essential read? Absolutely. You need to read Dark Empire, or at least hear its audio drama, because it is, like the Thrawn trilogy, a basis for things to come. Is it as much of an important foundation as the Thrawn trilogy? No. But it is important, and you owe it to yourself to check out Dark Empire 1. And maybe suffer through the 2 continuations. But at least read the first 6 issues, because they're actually pretty sweet. With that, we wrap up this episode. Thank you for watching, and may the Force be with the readers. I should also note, by the way, that I am a collector in some cases, whenever I can get them, cheaply and such, of signed Star Wars items, particularly expanded universe items. And one of the things I was able to get signed a while back when I started thinking, it'd be kind of neat to have the different launching points of the EU signed, like getting Heir to the Empire signed by Timothy Zahn. Well, I went ahead and also got Dark Empire #1, a copy of that signed, in this case, by Tom Veitch and Dave Dorman. You can see Dave Dorman's signature down there on the corner, and Tom Veitch there on the side. So I actually own like 3 copies of this issue. I got my original one that was a later print that's kind of beat up, plus a first print copy that's in much better condition that I got quite a bit later on, and this one, which I believe is a first print, which is signed by Veitch and Dorman, which I thought was pretty cool.